everybody, this is Robbie McKenzie, Youth Ministry 6.3. Got with me Benjamin Kerns. Benjamin is a great guy, great youth leader, and you're going to look forward to this interview. He did a recent post in which he talks about relationships with your ministers, with your preachers, and how to have positive relationships, and so you're going to enjoy this. However, my video didn't come through on this for whatever reason. Skype wasn't working, and so I only recorded his half. So you're going to see a lot of Benjamin and none of Robbie, which is good anyway. So sorry about that, but I know you'll get a lot out of Benjamin. He's a great guy. And so thank you so much for tuning in on this another episode of Youth Ministry 6.3. Thank you so much. This is Robbie McKenzie, Youth Ministry 6.3, which comes from Nehemiah 6.3. It says, I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down. I have with me Benjamin Kerns. Benjamin is an awesome guy, and I've learned a lot from his blog, Average Youth Ministry, averageyouthministry.com. And Benjamin and I are going to talk about some recent posts that he's done. And I interviewed one guy, a guy by the name of Dale Jenkins, and we talked about staff relationships from his perspective as the main preacher guy. And but I also wanted another perspective from the youth minister side of it, and so Benjamin, if you don't mind, just kind of tell us where your church context is right now, where you serve, and kind of how long you've been doing it.
Sure, I've been doing youth ministry, vocational youth ministry, for about 15 years. I've worked in 3 totally different contexts. I worked at a Presbyterian church for about 7 or 8 years in Napa, California, which is in Northern California. And then I worked at a church in kind of rural Washington, kind of right on the edge of civilization for about a year. And then I'm working at Marin Covenant Church, which is just north of San Francisco. I've been there about 7 years now already. So
NorCal, right?
NorCal, that's how we roll. What? Everyone asks if we surf, and we're all hip, and that's all the cool Southern California people, and so we just kind of hook up with them to have some street cred. But yeah, it's not like that up here, really.
Right, good. My brother actually lives in San Francisco there, so he's been over there and loves it. Says he'll never come back because I'm in Springfield, Tennessee right now, where it is currently 36 degrees. So he loves the consistency in weather over there.
Yeah, I've been to Tennessee before, and it's kind of nice, except for the humidity.
Oh, yeah.
And, there's zero humidity. It's beautiful. I could wear flip-flops today if I wanted, that sort of thing.
Okay. Try not to be bitter. But anyway, we'll move on. Just the first question, we're talking about how do you have positive relationships with staff? And so the basic fundamental question, Benjamin, is why even bother? I mean, what's the point? And it should be obvious, but just like to hear your take. What's the point of why have a positive relationship between youth minister, preacher, pastor, whatever? Why have a positive relationship?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple different reasons or different angles. From the most spiritual being, man, you're a part of the church and we're building the kingdom of God, and you want to be an encouragement to your pastor who's kind of carrying the spiritual weight of this congregation, and they have a really hard job and a lot of stuff's flying at them. And to be, a godly person, to care for them, to be an asset and to them is all upside. And so as you want your church to grow, as you want the kingdom to grow through your church, the more unified you are as a team, then the better shot I think there is at pulling that off. And then the most practical is I think we all want to just enjoy a healthy working environment. And if your boss is ticked at you, or you don't trust or respect them, or they don't trust or respect you, then there's tension, and then that tension kind of builds, and then you feel awkward and awful, and then they feel awkward and awful, and it just kind of like crumbles you from the inside, and it's just lousy. And I don't think anyone really likes to work in those kind of environments. Yeah,
it's tough to work in an environment where it's just chronically anxious. You know what I mean? It's just really difficult to do that. Just curious, what makes it difficult to have a positive relationship? And there's probably different angles you can go at this, but what makes it difficult to have a positive relationship between staff?
The issues that I've come up with, or when I talk with other youth workers, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is we're youth workers. We're the smartest, best people on the planet. We're idealistic, and we know how to move the church forward. And but so with all of our idealism and all of our passion and all of our kind of let me at it,
Right.
we have all of that, and then but yet we show up in a system where we're kind of the bottom of the totem pole, where and so we don't feel like our opinions and our perspective gets as much street cred as it should because I don't know, because we're the bottom guys,
Right.
you know.
Absolutely.
And so I think that causes some of it. I think in general, most lead pastors and preachers are a full generation or two removed from youth workers, and I just think the way in which a youth worker generation interacts, behaves, what they value, how they work, how they dress, how they approach scripture, how they approach the gospel, those are all things that just generationally are different than the next generation up. And so those things cause angst, and usually we're not reflective enough to go, oh, it's not my way is better and their way is worse. It's just a generational thing. And so but if that's not really well reflected on, then I think that just causes angst and anxiety and bitterness and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean we're all people, right? It's difficult to, it's like basically you're marrying the church, and so you got to have a good wedding, and to do that you got to learn different personalities of different team members. So it's got to be a challenge. Just let's get to the more positive side. Talk about some practical ways to get your preacher, pastor, or whoever. Let's talk about some practical ways. How do we get them on board? How do we get them to become, as you said in your post, the biggest advocate for student ministry? What are some practical ways?
Well, what I found, I've worked with 3 different lead pastors, 3 completely different personalities, and so your experience could be totally different. But my experience is that most lead pastors, they may like student ministry, they may have worked in student ministry, but it's not their thing. They don't wake up in the morning dreaming about the next generation and what are we going to do and how are we going to get after them. That's not their deal. They're called to the bigger church, the whole church, and they carry the weight of that whole thing. And so I just think that to get them to be an advocate for student ministry is mostly getting them to become an advocate of you.
Yeah.
And what I found is there's kind of 2 things. One, of course, is the really basic side, and one's the more kind of maybe spiritual, correct side. But I think all lead pastors at some point got into ministry because they love people, they want the church to grow, and they care about people. And so just like when a student comes up to us and says, hey, Robbie, man, I would love for you to hang out with me and help me understand scripture because I want to know God better, right? All of a sudden your heart goes, I used to hate that kid and now I love you and I'm going to bust out my whole schedule to spend time with you. And there's something that happens inside of us when someone in humility under us says, hey, teach me. I want to understand what you know. I want to know what you know. And I found whenever I've come and approached a lead pastor that way, like, man, you're the lead pastor. You're a generation older than me. You've been doing this for so long. You do know stuff, and you're old and crotchety right now, but I know at some point you did, and so spend time with me, and I want to learn. I want to understand how our polity works. I want to understand the books you're reading. I want to know when you were in seminary, what did you learn? Those sorts of things. People love sharing about themselves. They love sharing about who they are and what God's doing, and so if we put ourselves in kind of a more teachable moment and say, hey, teach me, mentor me, disciple me, I think that's going to always naturally build them up.
Absolutely. Here's the converse. The absolute opposite. And sometimes you learn from things you shouldn't do. What are some things to get your preacher to absolutely hate your guts? I'm curious. What are some things that you can do that will say, okay, that guy is not going to work at this church, or that guy, the preacher says this guy is, I don't like student ministry because of this guy, and that'll happen. So what are some things that we can do to the opposite, to get the preacher to not be the biggest fan of youth ministry?
I think it's funny. I think most of us think our evaluation and our success at our job is going to depend on our performance and on our numbers and on those kind of things. And yes, part of those things are true, but what I found is it's kind of more subtle than that. It's if your supervisor, preacher, pastor doesn't trust you, then there just becomes a break in relationship. And if they can't trust you, then things kind of break down. So things like anything that you do that makes them look bad, like if you blow up your church van and you don't tell him or her, that you don't tell them, and then all of a sudden someone rolls in the church parking lot and goes, "What's that?" They call your boss, and they're like, "What?" Like anything that throws them off guard. You have some event and some kid gets hurt, or two kids end up making out all night, and then their mom's one of the someone who talks to the pastor. Like all that stuff is normal and happens in our job. But if you are the person, if you don't tell your supervisor and they get caught flat-footed, that drives them crazy and helps them. All of a sudden, they stop trusting you.
Yeah.
But if you can, and I mean, I still make all those mistakes, and so whenever I do, Monday morning I roll into the office. This is what's going on. This is what happens, and he goes, "Oh, great!" And then if they ever do get the call, they already know. They're prepared. That sort of stuff. So I think simple things like just keeping them in the loop is a great way to have them be a fan of you. And another thing that'll cause them to hate your guts is if you get an opportunity to preach on a Sunday morning and you're preaching on a Sunday morning, everyone's like, "Oh, you're so great. You're so young and fun, and we can relate to you, not like the old crotchety pastor." and you start like taking that to heart and being like, "I am pretty awesome." And I get a lot of good feedback, and maybe I could start a church with these people. Any sort of time we kind of get ourselves, we take that affirmation from the church and kind of start mulling on, I could do that better. That all seeps out of us and causes all the undue anxiety for them. And one of my lead pastors was very straight with me. He's like, you need to be careful. People do love you, but they love you in your position.
Right.
Like, so all this affirmation is their worldview is, man, they love you as the youth worker. And a lot of times I've seen youth workers go, that means I should plant a church and split our church and do that because I have the right deal. And those kind of battles never end well for the lead pastor or the youth pastor or the church. So I think those are a couple things that just to stay away from those things, and then they don't hate your guts at all.
That's good. That's good. Super. Just share an idea that maybe personally, and it doesn't matter. You've talked about 3 contexts that you were in. Share an idea that allowed you and your preacher to really grow close together, and that allowed you to bond more. So just share a practical idea.
Sure. I mean, if you've ever come across that book, The 5 Love Languages.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's just that real simple concept that you love in the way in which you receive love.
Yep.
But what we want to do as Christians, I think in general, we want to understand how other people receive love and love them in that way. Okay. And so I think the best way you can build, good heartstrands with your preacher or your supervisor or boss is to figure out, how do they experience love? What are the things that they like doing? And figure it out and start liking what they like. And, in my first job in Napa, my pastor was into writing and reading. He read all sorts of crazy, hard theological books and loved politics.
Oh, wow.
And so I started learning about politics and reading Karl Barth and, having at it. And then we'd have lunch and I could be like, dude, what is up with this? And Karl Barth, he'd be like, tell me about it. I'm like, can you believe the elections? And then all of a sudden, then he's off running. And but those were things that, built strands. He got to talk about his passions, and I learned a ton. My pastor up in Washington was an avid salmon fisherman, and I am not a fisherman. I don't have waders. I couldn't tie a lure to save my life. But I figured it out. I've spent a couple Saturdays going up with him and fishing, and the drive up and sitting in the water, him sharing his passion with me, helped build heartstrings between us. And my boss now, avid sports fan and loves the Dodgers, which is, I'm a Giants fan, and that causes some problems. And at first I'm like, do I have to become a Dodgers fan for this guy to like me?
Oh, wow.
But the truth is, being, knowing about the sport and smack talking brought, got just as much kudos. Yeah. So I think it's just being aware. I think a lot of times we're just self-absorbed and we just think about our stuff and our way of doing things and our passions, and it's just wooing them. It's simply going, How do they like to be loved? How can we care for them? And just putting ourselves in their shoes and loving them that way.
Absolutely. We're last question, and I'm going to it takes a step back. So what are some factors that we need to consider? Say we want to have a relationship with our staff and we just want to start, besides talking about positives and negatives, what would you say? How do we start? What are some factors we need to consider when it comes to developing a relationship with our preacher?
I think the number one thing is we assume they're the boss, they're older, they've been doing ministry longer, and they're at some point just going to call us up and say, man, Robbie, let's start hanging out. I want to connect with you weekly. I want to minister, disciple you, I want to mentor you, or I just want to befriend you. And we kind of are always wait for them to kind of initiate that.
Oh yeah.
And then after a year or two, they don't, and then we get kind of anxious, and then it all unfolds. And I think it's the simplest thing is that it's on us to initiate. I'm a pretty passive person. I always wait for them, and I finally figured out that they're busy. They have a ton of stuff going on. They just want to make sure that the student ministry department is not blowing up in flames because they have 100 other fires that they need to put out.
Sure.
And so if we can just take the initiative in a humble and gentle way, like, man, I would love to hang out with you, or I know that you always go pheasant hunting, or I know that you like going backpacking or running, going, man, I'd love to do that, or I just need time with you, or can we set up a weekly time to do blah, blah, blah. And as long as it's not like, especially if it's something that feeds them, they're going to want to do it. If it's a weekly, moaning session about all the ways you're unhappy and the things that they suck and why parents, like, that's not going to be beneficial. But if it's trying to befriend them and care for them and get to know them, that's going to be great. But it's usually our initiative that has to pull that off. At least that's what I found.
That's great. That's great. Benjamin, thank you so much for interviewing. Hang on. This is another episode of Youth Ministry 6.3. We're talking about staff relationships. Benjamin Kerns. Check out his blog. It's amazing, averageyouthministry.com. I'll put a link to it on this video. And Benjamin, thank you so much for interviewing.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie, and all your 6.3 community. Peace out, man.
Take care.
Bye.